We're going to begin with the final segment of the afternoon. So just to quickly introduce our speakers. So Hilary Gresty has worked in the visual arts since the 1980s. She was curator of Kettle's Yard from 1983 to 89, immediately prior to which she was a research librarian at Tate. She has since worked in diverse roles as a writer, researcher and independent curator, and gained extensive expertise in public affairs and advocacy whilst running a professional body for the contemporary gallery sector. Most recently, Hilary initiated a Henry Moore Foundation-funded research project looking at women's sculptural practice in Britain from the 1960s to the present. Professor Jo Stockham is an artist based at Chisenhall Studios, London, who was recently Ampersand Fellow at the British School in Rome. This recent residency grew out of ideas encountered at Kettle's Yard in 1991 on her first trip to Rome with architecture students from the University of Cambridge, where she taught for 2 years as a result of her Kettle's Yard fellowship. Jo is currently a professor in the School of Arts and Humanities and head of MA Print at the Royal College of Art, London. And Dr Amy Tobin is Associate Professor in the Department of History of Art, University of Cambridge, and Curator of Contemporary Programmes, Kettle's Yard, as well as a Fellow of Newnham College, Cambridge. Her book, Women Artists Together, is forthcoming with Yale University Press this year. Okay, so without further ado, thank you all.
Right, well, thank you, Alina, for the introductions, and also to Lucy, of course, for organising today. And as Alina says, I'm Amy Tobin, a curator here at Kettle's Yard, and I teach art history in the university. And it's a real delight to welcome you all here to Kettle's Yard today and to Cambridge for some of you, but also to be chairing this event, which feels like a really nice homecoming for Lucy, who did her MPhil here at Cambridge and now is off doing her PhD in St Andrews, but also to have Alina organise an event here at Kettle's Yard. Alina's doing her PhD in Cambridge with me and Priya Gopal. But they also both worked at Kettle's Yard too, so it's particularly nice to see them bring their research to this space, as well as being excellent arts administrators. I think it's important to acknowledge that. So while other events in this Radical Art in Cambridge programme have focused on Cambridge Darkroom and St Matthew's Photo Workshop, today we're thinking about this artist residency programme that ran out of Kettle's Yard but in collaboration with a number of Cambridge colleges, and also had some synergies with other arts organisations in Cambridge. Between 1977 and 1993, where I think there was around 14 artists who came to Cambridge in this programme, which is an amazing achievement, I think. And today we're joined for the discussion by Hilary Gresty, who is here to my left, who was, as Alina said, a curator here during many of the artist residencies, and I'm sure stayed in touch with the institution after she left in 1989. And of course, Jo Stockham, who was an artist in residence at Corpus Christi College, has some close ties still remaining to the college, also taught at Cambridge following the residency in the architecture faculty, and who had an exhibition that emerged out of the residency, Changing Places, an artist in the laboratory, which is close to my heart because it is all to do with the old labs at Newnham, which is my college. And that took place 19th of January, 3rd of March 1991 here at Kettle's Yard, apparently. So today Hilary and Jo are going to share some reflections on the residency programme and its legacies from their different perspectives as organiser and participant. And then we'll open out for questions and discussion, and please feel free to ask us anything and we'll try to answer. But really we can just talk about anything you've seen this afternoon, from the archive show and tell, from the films, from the amazing insights that I'm sure Hilary and Jo will share. So we'll begin with Hilary, and it would be wonderful if you wouldn't mind sharing some of your experiences of organising this residency programme.
I mean, it seems a bit prosaic after the films we've seen. I mean, but I shall just talk about nuts and bolts of the programme, which I inherited when I joined Kettle's Yard in 1983. Paul Gopal Chowdhury was the artist in residence at Corpus Christi that year, and I think it had been going for several years before that. It was a very long time ago, so I'm not as it may all be very selective memory here. The residencies were funded by the then Arts Council of Great Britain, alongside a similar programme that ran in Oxford, so there was obviously some thinking there about them trying to give artists the opportunity to work in an academic environment. The Henry Moore Foundation took over the funding in later years when Kettle's Yard had been what they called, I think, devolved to the Regional Arts Board, who had perhaps slightly different expectations of the gallery. I mean, Anna will probably remember that more than me.
Residency.
Yes. There were very few galleries funded by the Arts Council in those days, as opposed to attached to local authority museums. I think it was a network, a very small network. So, the opportunities that we could provide artists were actually quite precious, really. In that sort of, we were given a lot more freedom than if you were working within a local authority, where obviously the demands through, local authority funding were more specific, possibly. So the residency was characterised by being absolutely no strings attached, which is probably quite unusual, and probably even more so now, though I'm not sure. We obviously had a mission of furthering public engagement, but the artist residency was primarily to give time to an artist to work as they wished with no outside commitments, and to have the benefit of engaging with the academic community as a visiting college fellow. So it was primarily artist focused. Sorry, Andrew.
Please contact Lucy Lane. Apologise to the room, it's become apparent.
So our aims primarily were to support the artists practically and financially to make new work, to allow cross-fertilisation between artists and academics, and to provide an opportunity for the artists to develop an exhibition for the gallery. Any other public-facing events were entirely really up to the artist and varied from residency to residency, though we did encourage them, but there was no obligation. The artists got free college accommodation, as Jo will remember, a studio, which we've seen the wonderful interior shots from Ian Baker's residency. It was incredibly cold, and that was an issue for the artists.
Same as London.
It was a beautiful environment, but I know it was very, very cold in the winter. And I mean, the studio itself was interesting in that it was the first laboratory in which female artists were allowed to actually carry out experiments. So that gave it a sort of slight edge in terms of understanding academia and Cambridge life, really. Yes, yeah. Lovely high windows and space, but not designed as an artist studio. So, again.
Do you know why they had that? Because they didn't want people to look in on the women. So that's why the windows are so high.
I can imagine. Well, we live in an old school and the windows are all up there because the children weren't allowed to look out. You'd have to be on a chair to see out of the windows.
So I was also told it was in the garden because they were convinced that the women, as chemists, were going to blow it out.
Yeah.
Really?
So it was like the only building that was outside of the corridor structure, because the corridor structure was built to protect the women from the male undergraduates.
Gosh.
Yeah, I know.
What's it used for now?
Exhibitions. We also practice music practice rooms and performance.
Yeah. I don't remember how the relationship came about and I also don't remember whether we paid rent for it.
Probably.
I imagine we didn't, but I can't recall that. That might be in the archive. The artist got a stipend which was either £8,000 or £9,000, but was generous
at the time.
generous for those days for the academic year, and they were the gallery funded an exhibition at the end of the year. We would arrange various welcome events, and the artist was encouraged, if they wanted to, engage in the education and public programme during the year. I remember Dhruva Mistry contributed a number of works to a postcard exhibition that we held. For example, he made lots of lovely little pen and ink drawings. I got a very beautiful one of my cat, actually, that he did for me on a postcard. It came from that show. Veronica Ryan curated a group exhibition which we saw some of the images from. And she was very active in wanting to do workshops. She did some school workshops, and though I don't quite remember how that came about. I think they were part of the residency, weren't they, Andrew? Were you there in Veronica's time?
I'd left by then.
Right, okay. Mary Kelly was asked in residence at New Hall. She did several sort of panel discussions, which were then sort of recorded and used for her teaching in, because she was still teaching in California at the time. And I can't really remember details of other public events that the artists did. Also, it was the days pre sort of a lot of evaluation. We didn't provide mentoring formally and all the things that would go with a residency today. Though I suspect there was some informal mentoring with the gallery, I don't know. But I can't remember. Do you remember, Andrew? I mean, no?
I remember my mentoring advice to Jo was make sure they know you're a fellow, because status was everything in the college. So that was a bit of mentoring that I lost.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
I always got told
that's
off for
Jo's.
walking on the lawn.
Yeah, and I said, no, just say you're a fellow and then everything's okay.
Yeah, Cambridge
I
specific.
remember
Yeah.
like sort of Dhruva appearing, and we were like, oh, it's Dhruva. You know, as if we weren't expecting to see him. Because they were, very much left to get on. And the other thing is, I guess it depends on the college and the relationship with the college, but Paul Winstanley, who I know well, in fact, I'd left Kettle's Yard, but I came up to see him.
He was in my
That's right, but he got on very well. I remember him, he still talks about his time at Churchill. You know, he really got into it. I think he might even still be friends with other fellows, you know.
Yes, well, I think it varied, but sort of
It varies
varied considerably according to the artist and also the college they were in.
But I'd introduce the artist to people I thought they'd find interesting.
Yeah.
So, for instance, like in Jo's year, it coincided with Deborah Levy, who then wrote a catalogue essay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then Nikos Papastikiadis was around. So interesting people doing PhDs, or just people who were around who I thought Jo would find interesting, or Paul and stuff.
Yeah.
Just the
Deborah and
obvious thing
Nikos.
to do as a curator.
Yeah, but I think Deborah and Nikos and I met each other because we kept going to the same lectures.
Yeah.
We just sort of looked at these people who looked a bit different and out of place and thought, I think they'd get on. So we kept going to things in, English lectures and stuff, hopping round.
Yes, I think it would vary very much according to the artist and the college. I think some colleges were more sort of friendly in some ways than others. That's probably more made more of an effort to involve the artist in college life. So legacies, because that's the other big thing. Obviously for the individual artists, there were big in meaningful legacies. as far as Cambridge is concerned, the two sort of big things probably would have been the women's art collection at Harriet at Murray Edwards, which came from the acquisition of the postpartum document, which was Mary Kelly's work, and presumably some very enthusiastic college fellows, I suppose, Harriet, who pushed that forward and continued to invest in what happened.
I remember spending the day with Mary installing it, but I can't remember much about the circumstances that might have led to that, and then subsequently.
Yes.
But,
Mary was very well suited to.
It was like it was as if it was written.
Yeah, I mean it was, but she didn't spend a lot of time in Cambridge either.
No.
She tended to bring her the benefits of her legacy through her contacts and her academic work.
Be the appropriate opportunity.
Yeah.
And I remember very clearly, I was assistant curator in Hilary, 85 and 86. And so I dealt with these submissions, and there was the usual kind of criteria, and it was the mid-1980s, so we were talking about sheets of slides, things like that. And Mary Kelly's submission was simply, it came in a jiffy bag, and it was her publication postpartum document. And it's quite possible there wasn't even a covering letter. It was just simply that. So immediately it stood out, and you would have been on the interview, not?
Yes, it was. I can't remember. There were quite a lot of college representatives and the funder,
But they must have just immediately.
I can't really remember an awful lot, except that it was very evident that Mary was a good fit. On that occasion, I think by that time the funding had shifted to Eastern Arts, and they did make slightly more demands on the programme.
Can I add something about the interview process? It was really challenging getting the dons not to ask personal questions.
As I say, dumb questions.
What's your marriage? Whether you were married, whether you had any they were like,
oh God,
it was just really awful. I'd have to brief them beforehand and say, this is not appropriate, but they still just plunged in and wanted to know if you were single, and it was really inappropriate. And then the other thing about, I'd say the thing that was radical about the fellowships was for the actual colleges themselves to have an artist in their midst, because I just remember this discussion so clearly at Emmanuel, and it was John Plum was the master, and the idea that an artist would come in who dipped between disciplines and was like an amateur researcher, they just couldn't handle that. They felt it really threatening to their expertise that somebody might, and I just remember those interviews when artists are incredibly articulate, but they say, well, yes, I am interested in biology, and I'm interested in history, and I'm interested in finding all these things out. So the radical thing was for them to see people who moved between research areas and made connections that they weren't thinking about themselves. So I think that's the right.
I think it was. The idea was to actually, just shake up academic thinking and public thinking about what an artist, might contribute to their lives and their dialogue. Because I think it was. But I know. What I always remember, I think it was Sue Arrowsmith, said that she found it totally exhausting because not only did she have to explain her own work, but she had to explain the lady, Picasso's Lady with Three Noses. That was sort of how she felt, was, this constant trying to justify contemporary art and explain it within the environment as well as...
Happens to me too. Still.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of, it is a... the other major legacy was obviously the Jesus College Sculpture Show, which came through Veronica's residency. At that time, Colin Renfrew was Master of Jesus, and he was a patron. In fact, he bought work. I remember this because he actually bought quite a lot of work from the Dislocations show, which it was almost again unheard of for the master of Cambridge College to come in and purchase work by a young contemporary artist. So he was they were great supporters, and I think this sculpture show ran until 2016-17, something like that.
Yeah, 2017 I think was the last one, sculpture in the
Yeah,
place.
and there's quite a lot of works in the Jesus collection in the garden from that era. But that I think was with somebody called Jim Roseblade, who sort of supported Veronica phenomenally and continued to promote the benefits of having a sculpture exhibition.
Yeah, and then Rod Munjum, I think, as well, continued it to the 2017.
I mean, I think the other thing that was difficult for the artists, I mean, Jo's spoken about, Anna's spoken about it, is that, contemporary practice isn't encompassed within art history, or wasn't then in any way, so it was very variously understood within the university. I mean, it was quite hard work, wasn't it?
Shall I represent art history?
Yes.
Bad object. Yeah. So there wasn't even an art history course then.
Oh, right.
It didn't actually get established until a little bit later, and certainly not as a full tripos until much after that.
So somebody like John Gage, I mean, they were teaching on what course?
People taught history of art and history of architecture, but they didn't have a degree. Yeah.
Right, I
think,
remember
as
that.
far as I understand.
Yeah. And I think the other thing for the artists very often, and I remember this again particularly with Veronica's case, is that Cambridge is a very privileged community, and it was we thought we were doing a wonderful thing by offering this opportunity to artists, but actually for them it could be quite difficult. It was so different to London life, the artists, the infrastructure of artists, what they were used to, and I think Veronica has spoken to me about it since. I think she was actually the victim of racism at that time. Though sort of we didn't articulate it as such, but I think that was very evident, really.
I mean, one thing maybe if we could talk a bit more about kind of the insiderism of Cambridge, and I mean there's all kinds of insiderisms here, but I mean one of the things we've said, that you all had to do a lot of work to kind of introduce artists to the city, to the colleges, to the university, but I wonder, and then artists could disrupt those spaces as well, but I'm also thinking about how Cambridge usefully impacted, or there was something unique about the space of Cambridge that might be kind of inspiring or useful for an artist.
I felt I'd landed in heaven in many ways. I got a very warm welcome from Anna and Marie and everyone at Kettle's Yard. And I was living in a beautiful modern flat in Leckhampton in the middle, overlooking a garden. And in London I was living in a really short life housing with no heating and had a bath in the garden. So I felt like it's kind of way, just everyday life was so much more comfortable. And my studio in London was freezing anyway, because it still is actually. I had to get central heating. So all the practical things about life were just, I was in heaven really. The thing that was difficult was I hadn't encountered a college system. I went to two independent art schools. I went to Falmouth and Chelsea, which are tiny organisations then. Well, Chelsea's now part of the University of the Arts. So I went to very small art schools, which didn't have wider academic structures. But because I'd always been interested in going to university, I was suddenly like, oh, this is my chance, So I sort of acted like a student. I sort of just decided, right, I'm a student. I'm going to go to all these lectures, and I just went to lots of things about, PPE things and English things, and I saw some amazing talks. We looked at all the notice boards and just walked in on the whole. And that was just incredible. So and also the reason I got the fellowship, I think I know, is because on my interview panel was someone called Dr Dewhurst, who was an astronomer, and he was on the board of the Whipple Museum. And I'd done a lot of research before I came because I was really surprised to get the residency. The other people being interviewed were much more established than I was, so I knew that I needed to do a lot of research, and I tell my students this: just don't take anything for granted. Go and do your research. And I came and spent a lot of time. I thought, what do I really want to look at? And I went to the Whipple Museum, which has lots of tools of geography and astronomy and things, and fell in love with it. And so I wrote about that in my application. And it so happened that one of the people on the panel was Dr. Dewhurst, and I'm sure that's why I got it. I remember someone falling asleep in my interview.
Oh dear.
Definitely wasn't there. So, it's sort of, so it was really amazing. But there were times when I found it really, really difficult. Because of all the rituals of high tables. Sometimes I was the only woman there. We sort of, when I met other women scholars there, we had a meal where we decided that, and I can't remember if I initiated it, but I might have done, when we would all go to supper at the same time and all go to the combination room afterwards. And it caused a complete consternation. Everyone was really, really anxious about what was happening because all of the women fellows were in the same space. And we all stayed on in the combination room after everyone else had left. So it was very funny. But it was such a shock in a social sense. And I was always so stressed about going to dinner because I didn't know which glasses to use and which knives and forks you should use for anything. I think the second time I had dinner, someone said to me something, I didn't realise the port had come round yet because I'd poured the wrong wine into the wrong glass.
Oh dear.
It was just sort of... So that bit was stressful. Corpus Christi. But I have to say also that they were really, really kind to me, especially Michael McCrum, who was in the master. In my head, I thought that the residency was like a whole year from September to September. And I was about to be evicted when I went back to London from this short life house. And so I just thought, I'm going to be here till September. And when I realised it was only till June, I thought, no, what do I do? And I went to the college and I just said, if I go back to London, I'm about to be evicted from my house. If I stay here, could I just stay for the summer? And Michael said yes, which was amazing. So they just let me stay on. And at that point, Newnham was thinking of turning the laboratory into a crèche, which I understand had been an ongoing issue for every year. And Kettle was losing it, wasn't it, for the residency. There was a real anxiety about how to get another studio because there was so little studio space around. So I moved out of that, and I did quite a lot of talks because I'd been working in gallery education before I came. I was really used to talking about other people's work mainly. So I did a talk here, I did a talk at Leckhampton, and I did a talk and I did open studios several times. And I met Lorna McNur, who was then running the first year architecture course, undergraduate course. And she was amazing, and she was running a course where she asked all the students to design a women artist studio. And of course everyone would say there are no women artists, and so then that began the kind of conversation. And then so that was really amazing. So I did crits there, started doing crits there, and then that's why I came to work in the architecture school for 2 years afterwards. And it really fundamentally changed what I thought about teaching as well. I think it's a real gift to have done that. And Lorna really trusted me to kind of speed understand architecture, but it's had a really effect on my work as well, I think, how I make installations and things.
Jo, do you want to show some...
Oh, I could show those few images. I recently went to Rome, partly because I'd reconnected to the work that I made here and used an image of my sketchbook that I made when, which I took with me on the student trip to Rome that I did with the architecture students. And I'd never really been to Rome before, so I sort of, when I was applying to do that residency, which has some parallels with this in one way, I was able to use a Kettle kind of 30-year-old notebook page. And so actually, I started all this work 30 years ago, and I'd really like to catch up with it and carry on with it, which is sort of what I feel I sort of did. But one thing it was lovely seeing Charlie because the documentation of the work and all the work was the sort of relationship to technology. When I was working in the architecture school, because they let me also squat in the basement really in the summer because I moved out of the studio. All the documentation of this time for everybody is on slide, as someone was talking about earlier, the slides. And so I actually don't have very good documentation. I've got very good documentation, but I haven't got it digitized. So, okay. So I've just got a very few slides. This catalogue, I remember Anna wanting to change the catalogue designers at the time. I think there was someone who was going to do it, who was doing really interesting things with typography, but it was very kind of poppy and kind of, I can't remember what it was, and I was kind of, I can't, that's not my work. And then Pavel Buchler,
we wanted it really dead simple.
Yeah, sort of, he was working at the dartroom?
No,
I think
he possibly just left and went to the No, he was still around. I think
he was, yeah.
Yeah. And then Chris Dorley Brown
did all the photographs, which
wasn't slides. He shot it on
I've got these ones, really amazing photographs I have in the studio, which were around here. So this was really, beautiful pictures of by Chris Dorley Brown. So yeah, they were a really amazing record. But I haven't sort of got everything properly scanned or in the right place. Or
do you want us to pass them round?
Yeah, you can. If they were on the table, please do. But they give a good sense of the kind of process of making. And of course, this is now the cafe, I think, isn't it? Space.
Or is it
No.
the shop?
It's the shop. Okay, that's the shop. So the brick
cafe used to be the office.
Ah, okay. Oh, okay. Yes, that makes
Which
sense.
was very cold, and it's still cold.
One of the things about being here was having so many different conversations about different sorts of structural things. So because I was next to the engineering department, I went to them and said, I've got a problem, I really want to build a sphere, and they just laughed because that's like the most difficult thing to build in engineering firms. So they were sort of, but they were really helpful. The two guys, particularly in the engineering department, helped me work out how to structure things really, and talk to me about materials, talk to me about trammels, which are really useful if you're trying to do big things with circles. So I got lots of, through informal discussion, I got so much knowledge that was just here, and I won't talk about these properly, but I was, as you can see, I was dissecting ordinary everyday things, these sort of footballs I found around Cambridge and dissected, and very influenced by things that were going on at the time about arte povera, using found materials. But this double image is something that came from a card in the Whipple Museum, an advertising card for a spectacle maker. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of became a kind of recurring form, which it remains. So I went to all sorts of lectures, also about science, particularly at the Whipple, about the histories of science and whether the difference between social understandings of science and sort of technical understandings of science, I suppose. Mapping was a very strong part and is a very strong part in a much less clear way of my work. So, these are just some of the sort of hemispheres which formed an unstable surface to think about 2 and 3 dimensions. And all of these things were made, some of these images were made of photocopiers, which basically they would be digital prints now, but digital prints weren't around. So also the way one makes work changes according to technology. So that's just a really graphic thing. But I suppose what interests me about talking about this now as well is that all of these things that I was interested in then, I'm still interested in. And I'm still looking for ways to create those links again, to try and work with people who are interested in the kind of imagery from science or from historical imagery, because for me it's a really rich discussion to have. And of course all our discussions are informed by the history of the time we're in. So this was the first exhibition that I took part in after COVID, which was obviously using a kind of recurring double circle, but in relation to an artist in Delhi. A whole series of us were asked to make work in relation to artists based in India, and they sent instructions, and it was in a garden in central London. So I sort of found myself drawing on this double circle because of the 2-meter rule, and because the world was covered in circles that were instructing us to keep apart from each other. And so that sort of sense that really simple, almost diagrammatic images can create discussions about social and political space is something that really excites me, and it really excites me about the effect that artwork and images can have in an environment, particularly in a way if they're displaced or not in the slightly the wrong place in some kind of way. I was looking at Murray Hall collection this morning with a friend I met here during this residency, who's an historian and who works there, and she was talking about the discussions that happened around the Maggie Hamling painting in the dining hall of a woman holding a Kalashnikov, and so I'm really excited by those kinds of discussions that can happen because of the images. So if anyone wants to join a image-led research project, that's what I'm trying to get together, because I think the fact that even if you don't know anything about the context of the image, if you just start talking to an image, because I worked in gallery education for years, I had the most interesting conversations I've ever had in those situations with people just encountering things together and trying to work out what they were looking at. And I suppose I still do that through teaching, which I love. So this is the page that helped me get to Rome. I just found that I was still interested in the same thing, celestial globes, Dante, who I became interested in properly. And this sense of how we are always translating images from art history or are placing ourselves inside histories is something I think that helps us to have conversations through art. So this is me pretending to be the figure in Goya's Flying Witches painting with a tiny figure. It's in the Prado. I was 3D scanned with a sheet over my head and printed myself out in this figure, and took with me to Rome this figure, which is from a museum in St Albans. I took her with me as a 3D scan and as a series of postcards. And so this kind of echoing through time of what engaging with different histories and being in a place and being given the incredible privilege that I had here, and I have just had in Rome for 9 months. I think that for me, just having conversations with people who are not artists about art is the most generative thing, because it says so many fundamental things about representation that is nothing to do with art, but it's to do with politics and gender and how we picture the world. And that's become really troubled by technology. So I'm really interested in that relationship to technologies. I tried to do things to do with computers when I was here, but I was so ignorant of them that even people trying to help me couldn't help me. You know, so I was just so low down the scale of. I bought my first word processor with my money. So that's the first thing I bought. Thinking about it, I bought a word processor and some sheets. I never bought any new sheets before, so it was like that was such an amazing thing to have. You know, sort of money to suddenly do things. But the word processor was, you know, massive old Amstrad thing without any image processing. So. In terms of thinking about how archives have changed and become accessible in different ways, I also think that there are interesting discussions to be had about all of this work, not my work particularly, but you know, this work that was invisible online until relatively recently, so it sort of becomes possible. And that's just doubt. That's just doubt. That's what drives me. And so that's an image from Rome, or from beginning to Rome, and there's kind of doubt and doubt. The doubt that I had here all the time was, what am I doing here? Because lots of people don't understand what an artist does or whatever. But in another way, and I think this is true of all residencies, and I say this to students now, I think if you're doing any kind of residency, you become an ambassador for art and what it is, generally. And I think that's really important, because you then either make it possible for other artists to join in and have that conversation too. I talked to Zarina before she applied about coming here and things like that. So, you know, I think that sense of how do you create spaces for other artists is also really important. And so coming and being in an environment that really introduced me to different kinds of disciplines was a complete gift and something I value, and has led to lifelong friendships. I'm still in touch with Anna, I'm still in touch with Jo Bernstein, who's curating here.
Should we join you?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jo and Hilary, for your reflections. So we've got some time for questions and discussion, comments, reminiscences. Please signal to me and I will call upon you. Anyone got anything they would like to ask or share? Well, while you think,
can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
I mean,
ask me a question.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I know it's funding, but you know, has Kettle's Yard considered, you know, substantial residences since?
Well, I mean, I think we look back on this programme with great envy. I mean, I know speaking for myself and not for the institution, I mean, I think I certainly would love to do something like this, not in the least because there's something very specific about Kettle's Yard being a house, and the idea of the kinds of like encounters that you can have with artworks but also artists, because Jim Eade was very close, and Helen Eade were very close to artists, right? They didn't just buy their work, they nurtured them, supported them, had dialogues with them. And I think, you know, that's something that comes through in the archive of the artist residencies as well. You know, it draws on that to some extent and updates it and changes it for the 70s through the early 90s. And we could do something similar. But on the other hand, you know, the art world and artists are quite different now, and the idea of pinning someone down for a full academic year, I think, would be quite tricky. And we tend to collaborate also with people. So, you know, there's lots of artist residencies that are run through colleges now of all different measures and scales and types. And so we try and be a kind of hub for those people to come and see us and reach out to them. But we also, for instance, the show that I'm working on for November, we've organised a residency as part of that, because that show is about an artist who came from China and lived in Taiwan. So we've brought a Taiwanese artist to Cambridge for a residency to kind of have that dialogue and exchange. And we've done that with Wising Art Centre, and they of course have a very, a very considered residency programme which really is tailored to the fact that people, are artists now, but they also have lots of other jobs and responsibilities and things. So it's good to work with them because they have the energy and the time to really give artists what they need.
Well, I just want to say, when we did the Paul Winstanley residency in '92, I set up a collaboration with Anglia Television, and I'm sure this was to do with Eastern Arts wanting them to become more public and have more of a public profile. So I ended up co-producing a TV programme, which was great. And it was hilarious because we went into Anglia Television with like the tiny, what were they called, those little video cameras? Camcorder. And said, we're going to shoot it on this. Yeah. And they were just like, just laughing because they'd never seen one before, like a big TV company. So that was fun. So that was a bit radical too. So.
Just something that Jo was saying, and it's very nice to hear that you had such a positive time, broadly speaking, and I know Paul did, but I know others haven't necessarily for kind of various reasons. And that thing about people not knowing what an artist does, but then isn't it the case that we rarely know what most people do? I mean, my little brother was a chemical engineer who actually was at Clare College at the same time that I haven't a clue what he does. And so isn't there something about the sort of collegiate environment which is about all sorts of people not knowing what they do and somehow interacting? So there's that, and then the other is, with hindsight now, what was happening during the mid-80s was radical. I mean, it was quite crazy. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, it was crazy. Yeah. But art was going through some quite significant shifts. Were similar things happening in other disciplines? Was that also happening amongst academics?
I imagine so.
With some resistance.
That's what were they just like in the Breakwell, or were they also dealing with?
I remember
the 80s were,
the big arguments
were quite a challenging time.
Ranked academia, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, there were very famous rejection of Derrida in Cambridge, but at the same time, there were also people who were absolutely pursuing, all of these radical, different epistemologies and philosophies.
I remember going to an electric seminar, I think in King's, with Foucault's translator, and people were screaming at each other. And we were thinking, wow, okay, this is interesting. In a way, they were really, really at each other's throats. It was quite extraordinary.
I mean, I think the reception would be different now for an artist. I mean,
you'd think so.
I don't know. Would it? I mean, I don't.
It's very. I mean, it's one can't really generalise. I mean, it's so different.
Ruskin has fellows in Oxford, and they're Samson is a big Instagram star.
Yeah, but Ruskin's an art school.
Yes.
Yeah, that's different.
It's a very different context here. But question back.
Hi, this has been really informative, and thanks to you guys over there for sharing with us. I'm just curious because I know that there can be loads of restrictions about what happens in and around colleges. So seeing Veronica Ryan's work on the grass there was, just wondering how challenging or easy it was to allow that.
I think the great thing was that Colin Renfrew was absolutely so supportive. I mean, he collected contemporary art, he bought things from the gallery, he became a trustee of the British Museum and things, so I think that was the clue there, that within Jesus there just were a number of people who wanted to make this happen. But yes, I mean, the sanctity of the lawn is... but you have the... don't they still have the Richard Long piece there in the gardens at Jesus? Isn't there still in the Master's Garden? I think there's still a Richard Long piece.
Alison Wilding, Richard Long, and Oh, well, he's
Oh,
the guy who
Brian
does
Flanagan, I think.
Flanagan
Brian
voice. But
Can I just add a funny story, which is that Nina Saunders, who did one of the Jesus College exhibitions, 93 perhaps, she installed parking meters along the lawn of Jesus College. That was fun. So, you know, they were up for it. And there were some very entertaining evenings. Like, I remember, like, Barry Flanagan and his mum invited to dinner at Jesus. And I think they just brought us in for entertainment. You know, this will be fun. Let's just get some artists in, but just novelty value, really.
But there were some
people.
I mean, there were a lot of academics who were very supportive. I mean, after I left Kettle, I did a project with the medical school with a lot of the medics and brought in artists largely to work with students on empathy, and it was the height of the AIDS crisis. So, you know, this was, you know, actually really quite substantial for the medical school to be doing this. You know, we brought in quite a lot of gay artists, you know, to talk to the students about actually the problems that were very real. And, but that was post-Kettle's Yard. But, you know, I think that it's, you know, Cambridge is receptive. It's just that there isn't necessarily enough, you know, there's enough, you need an awful lot of energy to go round, don't you, to make sort of, and the differences are small. And, you know, the legacy that Jo's work will have left in her college, you know, is unwritten really, but is there.
Overlook the impact upon students, which at the time might not be seen or measurable.
Yeah.
But, you know.
Well, I mean, Edmund Duval would come and paint the walls for us, for example.
You know, when I was here, so students included Edmund Duval, Ben Lewis, who went on to produce make TV programmes, Ian Hunt, Mark Quinn, who sort of demonstrated very little interest in art whilst he was here, but then went off to become an artist.
I think though this question about like the resistances of colleges is really crucial, because I think what we're able to speak to is the successes and the things that did happen,
and the things that might not have happened.
I think there are many more things that didn't happen, and I think there are considered contributions and considered things that are collected, but also a lot of things that aren't. You know, and Mary Kelly's work was not easily accessioned into Murray Edwards at all. Like, there's a lot of resistance from the fellowship, you know, and that is quite a liberal college, or it has been. So I think there's lots of things that maybe are quite hard to summon, and we'd have to think about how we could capture those histories more. But nonetheless, the successes, right, of what you were able collectively, all of you, to do and surface are
I think the other thing that I remember when I was delving back is that the Cambridge Festival was something that happened every summer, and the City Council, we did all these, we had Philip Barlow and Connie Parker and all sorts of people in the churchyard, didn't we? As part of those Cambridge Festival events. So I think there was, again, maybe a different different atmosphere within the city for wanting to see art, in public places.
One quick question, actually, that might be a good measure of like how far colleges engaged or not. You didn't have a residency in every college.
It was very difficult you had to, I mean, Anna will probably remember this, that you had to start your work several years in advance.
I found it very easy, actually.
Right.
I found it very
well, that must
receptive.
be the legacy that you were given, Anna.
I mean, you mostly pick colleges that you thought were a bit more sort of cool. I mean, in the sense that they might have had people there who would likely be receptive.
So maybe that's telling of where there would be resistance.
But, you know, for instance, Paul Stanley was at Churchill, and when he made his TV show, The TV Lounge, it was during the election. They went to film the election night in the TV Lounge, and it was that shocking moment when Thatcher got elected, and it was a completely out of the blue shock. And he thought, suddenly he realised the environment he was in, and it's like, you think it's all kind of liberal and friendly, but, on the night, when the votes were counted, all the students were cheering for the Tories, and it's like, oh my God, we didn't realise.
Clues
You
in the
just
name.
realise that actually nothing changes.
Yeah, question?
Yeah, I have a question that when I think about radical things, I just think a lot of work or action, just like positional action, like a pose, and easier to copy or easier to very drama for the audience. So I'm just thinking about the fundamental thing with the radical thing. When we think about something alive, some work theory, and when we back to the fundamental area, and maybe I just think it's some loose or alive thing can grow up new things from there. But I just think, how do you think about that? Or you do some real practice like in those ways?
Like how do you disrupt the foundations? Like how do you let activity happen? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've talked historically about how you made things happen, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it was by finding people who were sympathetic, I think, and who were enthusiastic, and going out there and talking to people, really, wasn't it, Andrew? I mean, the night in Bike City that we saw, I mean, we had 60 people, volunteers. They practiced a couple of times riding their bikes. That was sort of, to actually get 60 people to want to be in a public art performance in those days was probably quite unusual.
Yeah. It's like most things, people in all situations can feel threatened by whatever, and if something comes along where they don't feel threatened, actually people are really up for it.
I think so.
So they feel, so in an environment where traditions are very precious, but it's not only that, but actually underneath those traditions are a group of, incredibly powerful egos and things going on. Everybody's, very tense. But somehow if you can get right through that.
And it's also things like familiarity. I mean, with Matt's gallery and Tony Bevan, we had a massive painting in the City Library for well over a year. Because for whatever reason we managed to find somebody who was happy to do it, and it was, just a very good place to have a very large work of art in the middle of Cambridge.
But it was often very, the case in those days. It's just because you didn't write an email. You phoned them up, and often it would be down to whoever it was who answered the phone. And it might be somebody who was receptive or.
I think one of the ways that this residency program generated the kind of activity or destabilised the foundation is also because we don't have an art school in the University of Cambridge. So, there isn't a kind of student body who are sort of gathered around making and creative practice in the same way that there is at Anglia Ruskin or the University of Oxford. And so when artists come in, it really is an opportunity for reflection on the spaces that people inhabit and quite quickly become institutionalised by, and often that can be happy for them, but it can also be difficult and violent. So I think
also, certainly in my time it was quite interesting simply because the Cambridge Darkroom was also, and the Cambridge Darkroom had come out of a community photographic workshop, and people relate to photography in a way that they perhaps find it more difficult to relate to other forms of
that's a
art.
much more grassroots
organisation.
organisation.
And, so we were able to have a sort of two-pronged attack quite a lot of the time.
Yeah, and we had links to them.
Next tomorrow.
Okay, we have very little time, so we've got two quick questions.
Just really quickly, just on the town gown business. I was curator from 89 to 92. I grew up in Cambridge, and as a school girl, I had a job waiting tables. So I knew, left for the port, right for the claret, whatever it was. silver service. I knew how I'd been treated because I was just like some serving wench. So I knew what the artists were having to deal with and how to play the politics. And I think I kind of came back to Kettle's Yard because I thought, I know what this town's about, and I'm going to try and settle some scores and make it available to people who live here. So that was my agenda, and I think, using that insight to assist artists in their practice was quite important.
And I think when I was talking about how important the teaching at the architecture school was for me, there's certain aspects of realising the kind of extreme discomfort you can be in, which I talk about with students now, because people are coming from all over the place and coming into different environments they're not used to. And, I think it's really important to say this, whatever is here could be different, and also everyone within it should feel an agency to change it for the better, that it's about that sort of creating a community wherever you are, really. Because I was definitely overwhelmed by things when, in Corpus many times, even though people were being very hospitable. It wasn't a sort of deliberate thing. It was
and apologies to those in the room. It's the first time we've seen each other for years. So this is why we barely begun. The anecdotes.
Alex, did you have a...
Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I was just interested in the idea of the artist as a sort of radical intervention in the university sphere, and how far that can be pushed, because to leap back in history, I think William Nicholson came and lived in Jesus College while he was painting portraits. And of course William Nicholson is a super establishment figure, knighted, portrait. But nonetheless, I think even at that point probably counted as slightly disruptive, because he was an artist, and artists were de facto bohemians who led douche lifestyles and were irresponsible and feckless.
absolutely.
So it's interesting.
It's okay for Alex to say that because he is an artist.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, that whole sort of mythology about artists that if you're in, especially in university environments, I think, that don't study art, because I was asked to do all sorts of really strange things, like redesign the rugby club tie, and sort of, I don't know, there was sort of, and I was asked, I got very good at explaining why my work wasn't like Henry Moore's. Because it was sort of, because everyone asked me what I felt about the Henry Moore statue in the garden, because then, as a way to start a conversation. So it was a sort of, so that became a kind of gambit. But I also, when I came back for an alumni dinner one day, I experienced extreme hostility from someone who said, it's all right for you because you're an artist. I could never have done art. I wasn't allowed to do art or something. And they just sort of were really angry with me all the way through the meal. It was really weird. And I just sort of thought, okay, so this is someone who was very successful in their field. It wasn't that they weren't. But I just thought, maybe the extreme pressures of a very academic environment, even if you're successful in it, isn't obviously what everyone wants.
That's
you know
what
I mean?
I mean about people, they feel threatened.
Yeah. I just was really shocked.
They're vulnerable. I think a lot of people within these very established contexts actually quite vulnerable.
Because incredibly competitive as well.
I mean, Kettle's Yard, certainly, in my memory, we did have fantastic support from academics and
Yeah.
in the university as well. It was absolutely sort of, people that were really engaged, really wanted to be involved.
We're not
made
all
things
socially
happen.
inept.
But
No.
But the institution
I think
is quite difficult. The institution. I mean, I remember my first week. It was suggested maybe I should wear a dress for the concerts.
Yeah.
Which took me aback slightly.
But also I did.
No, I didn't. I can't even remember.
I did practical workshops here as well, and the professor of archaeology came and got really stuck in, and I found that was really good, because he actually told me that helped him to understand what I was doing, really, by doing this really, I can't remember what it did, but it was a, practical workshop.
Yeah,
and I got incredible support from people. Took me to all sorts of places. You know, I got to go to the astronomy department. I got to go to
I think
sort of
one
libraries
of the
and
things
archives.
that you said about like being able to just walk into any lecture, I mean, that sort of speaks to one of the great advantages of Cambridge, is that
Amazing.
any lecture is open to any member of the university, and you know, they do talk to each other, and those dinners, as like ritualistic as they are also opportunities to talk with people, and people understand that and are willing to share. So you might have to say the same thing over and over again, but you know, you might also hear something new. And I think it's, you know, we should be real and also be really honest about all of the privilege and the barriers that Cambridge represents, but also think about what's possible to do here that isn't possible.
No, I think that's
other
really
places.
important, and that's why I wanted to go to Rome, was to re-experience in a way what I had here.
Yeah, British
Because
School
it
at
was
Rome, another
so
one of those
extraordinary.
institutions.
Because you just get to meet people who are passionate about something, and that's. I mean, I'd go and see almost any lecture here just because you'd see people who are passionate about something and knew a lot about it.
So on the note of passion, should we draw this to a close at last?